It's 10:30 on the 21st of June, and 2 days later than planned, Westminster is all set to hear the Queen's speech in one of the most uncertain periods in British politics for decades. So stay with us for the state opening of Parliament. Very good morning from Westminster. Lovely sunny day. Who knows what the day will bring? It's the start of a brand new session of Parliament. A hung Parliament, of course, following the recent election when the Conservatives lost their majority in the House of Commons. The Queen will deliver today's speech against that backdrop of a succession of terrible tragedies, in Her Majesty's own words: the recent fire in North Kensington, the terror attacks in London and Manchester, all of which have created a sombre national mood in that statement issued by Buckingham Palace just a few days ago. And this in a momentous week in the modern history of the UK. Talks are already underway to take Britain out of the European Union, and this Queen's speech is expected, therefore, to set out a legislative programme for not 1 year, but for 2 years to come. Well, earlier this morning, this is what happened in Downing Street when the Prime Minister left for Parliament.
Your first and last Queen's speech, Prime Minister.
That was Mrs May with her husband Philip on the way to the Houses of Parliament. Of course, she's had to spend considerable time trying to negotiate a deal with the Democratic Unionists of Northern Ireland in recent days to support this Queen's speech, and as I speak, there's still no deal in place, but that was part of the reason, of course, for the delay in arranging this state opening today. Labour's Jeremy Corbyn will also be in the Parliament today, of course, facing the Prime Minister once again across the dispatch box. That's when the Queen's speech debate gets underway, and he'll be looking to amend the speech in line with Labour's commitment to end austerity policies and boost public spending. We'll be seeing more of Mrs May, Mr Corbyn, the other party leaders, a little later on, and we'll also be talking to some of the newest MPs as they settle in, those who were elected just a few weeks ago. But as usual, on the day of the state opening, the ceremonial event started rather early on. Take a look at this. Here we have the Yeomen of the Guard, the oldest British military corps still in existence, founded by Henry Tudor. The Battle of Bosworth in 1485, armed there with the great key to the Palace of Westminster, they were performing their ceremonial search of the cellars. They're just making their way through the chamber of the House of Lords and then going down to the cellars. That's where Guy Fawkes was discovered back in 1605. So when we talk about a Queen's speech today and a state opening that is slightly less formal than usual, well, there are still very big elements of the formal ceremonial taking place. And everything ready at the Sovereign's entrance at the southern end of the Palace of Westminster. This is where the Queen will be arriving within the hour, but there'll be no grand carriage procession this year. As I mentioned, it'll be a much more understated affair. If it can be understated, that is, when you look at the magnificent space of the House of Lords, the masterpiece designed by Barry and Pugin, completed back in 1860, hundreds of peers already in place in the chamber. And no wonder, it is the main ceremonial event in the parliamentary calendar, so the competition for seats is intense, and Norman Lamont, the former Chancellor, already in place. Hundreds of peers, 800 peers in all. This is one of the biggest parliamentary chambers in the world. And of course the speech will be delivered from the throne of the House of Lords. We'll be back in there in a moment to spot who else has bagged a seat for this great occasion. But as I say, in terms of style and possibly in terms of tone, let's see, it'll be rather different to previous years. Now, with me in our studio, facing the Palace of Westminster, representing the biggest parties in the House of Commons, we will be joined shortly by Brandon Lewis for the Conservatives. We already have Yvette Cooper for Labour and Joanna Cherry for the Scottish National Party. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good to see you. And, of course, as ever, Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor, is with us to give her analysis as we go through the day. Laura, what are we looking forward to today?
For you, I just think watching the yeomen process through, these traditions in place, unchanging for centuries, the irony in such a time of volatility and uncertainty is just profound today, isn't it? We'll see much of the usual pomp and ceremony, slimmed down, of course. But right now, Theresa May who is expecting her own political coronation today, is a fundamentally weakened leader. All the conversations inside the Tory party are turbulent underneath the surface about how long she can stay in power. So we will see today in the Queen's speech an exact demonstration of how she has been reduced, because her ambitious plans to change the country in big, bold ways have had to be culled, they've had to be scaled back, and at the centrepiece of the speech is the mind-bendingly complicated issue of how we go about our departure from the European Union.
And overshadowing it all, and I'll come to our guests in a moment, the fact that, of course, we're talking about a minority government, potentially depending on the DUP for support, but that deal still not having been nailed down.
They will have to depend on the DUP for support whether or not this actual deal ever gets done. Now, we had been expecting it some days ago. I understand that actually the revised Queen's speech was agreed between the two sides days ago. But there is still an element of haggling over the details. There's been frustration on both sides. And also, in a government that has been in such turmoil, there is also, frankly, a capacity issue. One source on the DUP side has said, look, a lot of this is about the fact that number 10 just doesn't work at the moment. So the sort of physical logistics of getting this done, when there have also been all of those other challenges, all of those things going on, of course, the Grenfell Tower, as you mentioned in your introduction. This is a weakened government that is being stretched like a piece of elastic to breaking point, and they have not, in that context, been able to close this deal with the DUP. Whether or not there is actually a formal deal done, and I still suspect that it will be, because the incentive is there on both sides, the DUP will still need to give the government their support on big, important votes. Don't forget, amongst all the speculation about this particular deal, the DUP has informally basically been doing this for the government in the last couple of years anyway, just behind the scenes. And during that period, frankly, it quite suited both sides to keep that on the quiet.
Laura, thanks. Yvette, what are you looking forward to today?
Well, we want to see a different approach from the government. They cannot simply carry on as if the election didn't happen, and that's, I think, has been the real concern. You know, other people have made the point that Theresa May warned about a coalition of chaos. We've now got the chaos. We don't even have a coalition. And I think some of the comments that came from the DUP yesterday were really damning when they were saying that the government didn't even seem to be capable of negotiating with them in order to get a very basic confidence and supply deal. And a confidence and supply deal is simply an agreement not to vote against the government in a no-confidence motion and to make sure some of the basic funding goes through for the National Health Service and so on. It's really minimal. So if the DUP is saying the government's not even capable of doing that sort of negotiation, that is really worrying for the Brexit negotiations. I do think they should change their approach to the Brexit negotiations. They should do a cross-party commission or a different kind of approach, because otherwise we're not going to get something that's sustainable and something that's in the interests of the country.
Thank you. Joanna, your take on today?
Well, like Yvette, I'd like to see an acknowledgement from Theresa May that she doesn't have a mandate now for a hard Brexit, nor does she have any mandate to continue with the Tories' austerity agenda, which was always a political choice rather than a necessity. So I'd like to see a softening of tone on Brexit and a recognition that the Scottish Government brought forward at the end of last year a blueprint for a soft Brexit, whereby the whole of the United Kingdom, which failing Scotland, could stay in the single market. And indeed, the Welsh Government also have put forward tangible proposals which would stop the whole of the UK from going over the cliff edge that the Tories were so intent on taking us off before the election. So I would like to see Theresa May and the Tories look seriously at those proposals put forward by the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales, and to guarantee a seat for those devolved nations at the negotiating table. I also want to hear from the Tories what this deal with the DUP is about. The DUP have a worrying record on some aspects of human rights, women's rights and LGBT rights. I want to know that human rights will be respected in this deal. And I also want to know, crucially, that the negotiations for the power-sharing administration to go back in place in Stormont will not be threatened by the DUP being given some proffered position, some preferred position within the British Parliament.
We'll try to pick up quite a few of those points as we go through. And as I say, if we're joined by the Home Office Minister Brandon Lewis for the Conservatives, we'll get the Conservative viewpoint as well. But we mentioned that this year's ceremonial aspect will be a little more understated than usual. This is because the unexpected election, of course, the very busy calendar of major state events at this time meant there was less time for the key participants, especially the armed forces, by the way, to prepare for it. So when Her Majesty arrives here, it'll be by car today. And when the procession takes place inside Parliament, the Queen will not be wearing the usual crown and the parliamentary robes. It has happened before, by the way, but you need to go back 43 years. And that was in March 1974. After the snap election called by the Conservative Edward Heath, when he lost his majority. Does that sound vaguely familiar? So at the state opening, the Queen travelled by car in 74, and during the ceremony did not wear the imperial state crown. We're going to see that replicated today. There hasn't been a state opening like this in nearly half a century then. I suppose you could apply that to the politics too. More of that in a moment, of course. But let's quickly get our bearings then in the Palace of Westminster ahead of the Queen's arrival. Just explain the geography so that you know what's going on when it all happens. Behind us here, on the green, the Great Sovereign's entrance at the base of the Victoria Tower. This is where the Parliamentary Archive is held. Dominates the landscape for quite a range of for quite a distance around, across the bridge there to St Thomas's Hospital and along the embankment. Now, the Household Cavalry will be inside. They will be lining the royal staircase. And when the Queen arrives, she will go into the robing room. That's just to the left there, just ahead of us. Well, cameras are not allowed in there. Some of the procession's already gathering, by the way. The gentlemen at arms there getting ready for the Sovereign's arrival. The Imperial State Crown will have been placed in the robing room, directly ahead of us, ready for the ceremony to take place. What happens next? Well, the Queen will then begin the formal procession. She will leave the robing room and go into this magnificent space. This is the Royal Gallery, one of the biggest royal spaces in the Palace of Westminster. And today it's full of diplomatic and military guests, all keen to see the procession, though I say it'll be, rather different to the ones we've seen in the past few decades, but it's still good to be a pretty grand sight. And then through to the small Prince's Chamber. That is the little chamber that lies between the Royal Gallery and the Chamber of the House of Lords, full of Tudor portraits of Tudor monarchs, and it's dominated by this great white marble statue of Queen Victoria. And then from the chamber, we go into the House of Lords itself. And that is where the signal will be given by the Queen to summon members of the House of Commons to come along and listen to the speech. And they'll be there to listen very intently to what's going on. After which, of course, the Queen will depart and lots of debate will begin. But there we have the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York taking their places today. Also sitting there rather patiently, waiting for the events to begin. We saw him a little earlier in Downing Street, is Philip May, Prime Minister's husband. But already now the House of Lords packed with hundreds of peers, lots of them waiting for the speech to be delivered. I should say that when the speech is delivered, it probably won't take more than maybe 7 or 8 minutes. But, of course, the content is all important. How many bills and draft bills will be listed? May well be more than 20 of them, but we'll have to wait and see for when it's formally published. And then we'll talk a little more about what happens when the Queen arrives and how the Commons are summoned. Let's come back to the studio for a moment, because the Home Office Minister, Brandon Lewis, has joined us. Welcome, Brandon. You had us worried for a second.
Good morning. Well, security is pretty strong.
It's pretty strong, and that's understandable. What are you looking forward to today?
Well, I think the Queen's speech it does two things. One is, obviously, it does set out the programme for the Parliament and the government's business. But I think it's also a reminder of the great constitution and actually the way we do things here in Britain, and a chance to see Her Majesty, which is always a good thing for everybody. A
speech dominated by the Brexit challenge?
Look, there's no doubt that over the next couple of years, the key thing is actually getting that Brexit legislation through Parliament to prepare ourselves for what will be 2 years down the line as we leave the European Union, and what flows from that as well. And that is going to take a substantial amount of time.
We'll talk a bit more in a second, but thanks very much, Brandon, for now. We were talking about the geography. It's a very short distance from the Lords to the Commons, by the way. You go through the heart of the Palace of Westminster. This is the central lobby. It's another magnificent sight, a great work of art, really. And I want to join Vicki Young, who's there for us.
And this is a great vantage point to see some of the iconic moments of the day. It will start with the Speaker's procession that will come through here and that cry of hats off strangers. Then Black Rod will make his way from the House of Lords down to the House of Commons to invite MPs to go and hear the Queen. And tradition dictates that that big wooden door is slammed in his face, a very important symbol of the independence of the House of Commons. Now, we're here, of course, because of that snap general election, and the result delivered a much more diverse House of Commons. There are more women MPs, more gay MPs, and more representatives from the ethnic minorities. There are also just a few MPs who probably didn't expect to be here at all. We've been catching up with two of them as they've got to know this Palace of Westminster.
My name's David Linden. I'm the new Member of Parliament for Glasgow East. This is my first week in Westminster, and this is me walking to work with the Palace of Westminster in the background, which is still a bit of a strange experience. But
that moment when it's read out that you have been elected, I think might go down in my life as one of my proudest moments.
So this is my wife, Roslyn. This is my papa. This is my stepdad. This is my mum, my granny. So we're all here for my parents, and the rest of my family have just been so proud, and then they should be, because they are as much a part of this as me. I wouldn't be here today and have the confidence to go and do this if it hadn't been for my mum. I was brought up by a single parent, so I think the fact that she went out and she worked 3 jobs and she kind of gets encouraging me to go and do things that might have been above my station otherwise. I think she's just really proud that that's kind of paid off.
The question is that Mr. John Bercow do take the chair of this House as Speaker. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
So this was the election of the Speaker of the House of Commons that I just attended.
To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it.
It was the first opportunity to be in the chamber with lots of other MPs. The behaviour is just so strange. It is really like nothing I've ever experienced before. It was quite surreal sitting there thinking, I am about 20 yards away from the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But, it's just one of these things. I'm just going to have to get used to this now.
Please, could you give your name and constituency?
Layla Moran, Oxford, Western Abingdon. Swearing in is tradition, and they ask you what version you want to take.
Would you like to swear or to affirm?
Affirm. I had to ask, do you put your hand up or not? I wasn't sure if you had to do that. He said, whatever you want. I thought it was, no, let's be more natural. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law. But now it means I can start, hopefully, asking questions and writing to ministers, and now I can officially do my job.
Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law. My first week here in Westminster has just been an absolute whirlwind, and I don't think the job of being an MP is one that you should ever get used to, because you should always remember that what the voters give, they can take away.
Two members of the new intake here at Westminster, David Linden and Layla Moran, looking forward to their challenges. Early impressions, very early impressions of life at Westminster. They're getting stuck in, of course, at a time of colossal political challenge for the UK, with those Brexit talks just getting underway. And the Queen's speech, as we were saying earlier, will contain legislation which will define Britain's future. Let me just share with you an announcement from Buckingham Palace in the past few minutes. We were expecting the Queen to be accompanied by the Duke of Edinburgh today, but the Duke of Edinburgh, sadly, was admitted to King Edward VII Hospital in London last night as a precautionary measure, says the Palace, for treatment of an infection arising from a pre-existing condition. The Palace says that Prince Phillip is in good spirits, that he is disappointed to be missing the state opening of Parliament, and so thoughts clearly with the Duke of Edinburgh, who is in hospital since last night for treatment of an infection arising from a pre-existing condition. Let's take a look inside the Palace of Westminster, because this is the ceremonial taking place right now. The Yeomen of the Guard, led by the Captain. The Captain, by the way, is a political appointment, the Deputy Chief Whip in the House of Lords. The Yeomen, who form such a colourful part of the ceremonial events here at Westminster, and indeed on other state occasions too. And they are taking their places in the Royal Gallery, ready for the Queen's arrival a little later on, and they'll be moving then into the, when the procession moves a little later, into the Prince's chamber. So the Yeomen are doing their work. And, of course, a little later on, we'll see the other royal bodyguard, the gentlemen-at-arms. They are also here today. Just to underline the fact that when we say that the ceremonial has been reduced a little, certainly has in terms of the Queen and members of the royal family, there are certain fixed features of the day in terms of the state opening that are reassuring, and they are still in place. Earlier on, the Household Cavalry took up their positions on the royal staircase. Let me just show that, because this is a dismounted detachment of the Household Cavalry. Normally they're pretty young recruits, very proud to be taking part in today's state opening, and they're led by Major Alexander Owen. He's commanding the staircase party. He, from the Blues and Royals, mentioning a short while ago, the gentlemen-at-arms, former officers in the armed forces, and the captain of the gentlemen-at-arms is the Chief Whip, the government Chief Whip in the House of Lords. That's another political appointment, but they too will be a prominent feature of today's ceremony, and they will now march through the Royal Gallery and into the Prince's Chamber, ready for that procession. A little later, when the Queen and now the Prince of Wales, not the Duke of Edinburgh, will be processing through with the crown, ready for the Queen's speech to be delivered from the chamber of the House of Lords. So the ceremonial coming together, and the Queen will be leaving Buckingham Palace probably in about 20-25 minutes' time. Let's come back to the studio for a moment, because it is important for us to underline not just the ceremonial element, which lots of you enjoy, I know that, but of course the crucial thing is the content of the speech. What does it tell us about the government's plans? What does it tell us indeed about the government's ambition? And the stability of government? What can we read into all of that? So back to Laura again on this, and we mentioned, Laura, that the big chunk at the heart of the speech will be Brexit legislation. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little more about that, and indeed what that means in terms of the pressure to get it through.
OK, well, huge pressure all around. But if you like, there are two main chunks to this. The first is the repeal bill, which will technically take us out of the European Union and for now put all existing European law that's been part of our law onto our statute books. So that means when we leave the European Union, expected to be in March 2019, we have a legal system still in place. We have laws, they don't just disappear in a puff of smoke because we're out of the European Union. So that is the first big bill. And the Labour Party and the SNP and likely the Liberal Democrats will absolutely try to amend as much of that as they can to do it in their image, not just because they believe that their policies will be better, but also because in this new political landscape, with things so volatile, the Labour Party and the opposition have got huge opportunities, frankly, to make an awful lot of trouble. And for those Conservatives who had been less than enthused about Theresa May's vision for taking us out of the European Union, the question will be, do they stay loyal and not rock the boat, or do they go over to the side of opposition MPs because of their principles, whether that's on the balance between immigration and the economy or on our position inside the single market? That is going to be the question, day by day by day. The other chunk of the Brexit legislation are when you get into the world after Brexit. So what will our new immigration system look like? What will our new system for agriculture look like? And I understand there'll probably be 7 Brexit bills that will deal with what is nothing less than a complete reforming of huge areas of policy right across the board.
And all of that, Brandon, with a minority government. It would be a challenge for a majority government. It would be a challenge for any government to get that through, even with a hefty majority, because there are so many unknowns and so many uncertainties. But in your position, having to depend on a party with whom you haven't struck a deal yet, you're bound to tell viewers that there are no guarantees here, are there?
Well, taking through leaving the European Union was always going to be a very complicated, difficult negotiation and piece of work, and that Great Repeal Bill is going to have a lot in it. Colleagues across the House can have a view. Our job will be to manage through Parliament, get that bill through, and actually do our best to persuade other parties that actually what we're looking to do is the right thing, and we'll see that as we get into the detail of the Great Repeal Bill itself.
That confidence, do you think it's well placed or not?
Well, the government's going to have to work in a completely different way, and so far there's not been enough sign of that, because they are going to have to build consensus to get anything through. And I am concerned the way we were expecting the government to do the Great Repeal Bill and all of this legislation, we understood, was to do it in a way that basically took power into the hands of the government. So gave the government the power to change things as it so chose in future, and Parliament would give it the permission to do so. That was always a bad way to do this, but it's even more so now. When you have a hung Parliament, I don't think that Parliament, a hung Parliament, will want to give the executive and the government permission to just do whatever it wants with a series of these regulations or with different kinds of European arrangements, which may be important, may have consequences for workers' rights or for environmental standards. You cannot simply hand over concentrated power to a government, and a minority government which does not have the support of the country, to just do whatever it likes, They're going to have to be much more responsive to Parliament.
That cross-party principle, to what extent is the SNP committed to that?
Well, we showed in the last Parliament that we could be a very effective opposition, even where the Tories had an outright majority. Let's not lose sight of the fact that Theresa May held this general election because she thought she was going to get a blank cheque to do whatever she wanted. She hasn't been given that by the voting public. The SNP, we have more seats in Scotland than all the other parties put together, but we will work with other parties where appropriate to make sure that Scotland's voice is heard in these Brexit negotiations, and also to make sure that the Tories now take off the table their austerity agenda. As I said earlier, it was always a political choice, not a necessity, and they no longer have a mandate for that approach. So we'd like to see this Queen's speech moving away from the austerity agenda, as well as tackling the challenges of Brexit.
But it's not just a concept of working with other parties. I mean, I think, unless I'm getting this wrong, Yvette, you are talking about a proper cross-party collaboration which involves all parties in terms of the approach to Brexit. You, Joanna, seem to be talking about collaborating in opposition, if you like.
Well, we've always said that we are willing to work with other parties on the left in a progressive way. We wouldn't work with the Tories, we've made that very clear, but there's no need for us to do that. We'd be very happy to work with Labour on a case-by-case basis, but Labour will need to recognise the requirement for Scotland and the other devolved nations to have a seat at the negotiating table. Now, the new Labour Shadow Secretary of State seemed unsure as to what her position was, and I'd like to see Labour now swing behind the Scottish Government and argue for the Scottish Government and indeed the Welsh Government and the Northern Irish administration, when we have one, to have a proper seat at the negotiating table.
We're battling the clock, and I know Laura wants to come in. A quick word, Brandon, on your thoughts on the calls for a proper cross-party collaboration on the Brexit approach. Does that appeal to you or not?
Well, I think certainly in terms of the point Joanna just made around the devolved administrations, that has been happening. I've met with both Scottish, Welsh and Irish ministers in the talks we've been having so far on Brexit. And we've got to continue doing that, because this is about getting the right deal for the United Kingdom.
Quick word, Laura.
I was just briefly going to say, the decisions by the other opposition parties as to how far they're willing to work together or whether they're willing to work with the government will be absolutely fundamental, because although the Tories are in a very, very, very bad place, even if they don't get a DUP deal, unless all the other opposition parties work together, they don't have the numbers to effect the changes they want.
This is Buckingham Palace, and the first cars to depart are actually bringing some of the regalia. So the first state car is bringing the Imperial State Crown. Normally, of course, they come in a big carriage procession, and the Household Cavalry very prominent. That's not the case today, so we have the first state car, the Crown, being accompanied to the Palace of Westminster by Andrew Ford, Sir Andrew Ford, who's the controller in the Lord Chamberlain's office. And then we have the Crown Jeweller, Martin Swift, who's also there looking after the Crown. The Crown will be brought to the Palace, will be put on display in the Royal Gallery, and then a little later will be carried in the procession in front of the Queen. That's how it's going to be arranged today. And then in the second of those state cars, it's a great sunny sight, isn't it, across St James's Park from Buckingham Palace there. In the second of those state cars, the Cap of Maintenance and the Sword of State, two great emblems of the sovereign's power, they too are being brought to the Palace of Westminster, where they also will be put on display in the Royal Gallery before that procession starts. So that's the scene. The first of the cars having left the palace, and very soon, within about 15-20 minutes or so, we will see the Queen and the Prince of Wales leaving for the state opening. And as I underlined a short while ago, there will not be place today for the Duke of Edinburgh because sadly he is in hospital since last night. Buckingham Palace said that he's very sorry to be missing the state opening itself. So the cars are on the way. And as Laura was saying, the government's success in getting legislation through the House will depend not only on their relationship with the DUP, but also managing their own backbenchers. Parliamentary whips, of course, will be very busy in the coming months. Other parties, too, will be sought in terms of their support in certain areas. Let's join Vicki once again in the central lobby.
That's right. Remember back in 2010, David Cameron for the Conservatives did a coalition deal, a formal deal with the Liberal Democrats, which did give 5 years of government. Central to all of that was this man, Alistair Carmichael, who joins me now, now the chief whip for the Liberal Democrats.
Hi.
This is going to be different, though. There's going to be no formal coalition.
Indeed.
How is it going to work with a hung parliament?
Well, time will tell, because, you know, the government doesn't have their majority. They called an election unnecessarily. They didn't get the majority. What's interesting, though, is the attitude that we're seeing from 10 Downing Street. For all intents and purposes, Theresa May seems to think that she can just carry on as if nothing has changed, when in fact everything has changed. She might get her confidence and supply arrangement that would deal with the Queen's speech, it might deal with the budget from the DUP, but that only gets them to the starting line. If she's going to have any authority in government, they need to win every vote every day. And that is going to mean that as a government, they need to talk to, they need to reach out to parties across the political divide. It will remain to be seen whether or not Theresa May has either the inclination or indeed the ability to do that.
Have they reached out to you? Have the Liberal Democrats had any discussions with the Conservatives about this Queen's speech?
We've had no discussions with the Conservatives about the Queen's speech. We've not even yet formally, I understand, seen a copy of the Queen's speech. So we will get that with the rest of the world.
It obviously will have many Brexit bills in it. The Liberal Democrats stood at the general election on a platform to have a second referendum on any deal.
Yep.
Every party has its price. What would you want to hear from Theresa May to back?
Well, the things that are important to us are the things that are going to give us a bit of certainty and a bit of security for our economy and our jobs. So if Theresa May comes forward with a deal that says that we will remain part of the single market, for example, or we will have good access to the single market, then, you know, we will park the partisan politics because the national interest is at stake here, and they will get support from the Liberal Democrats for good, sensible things that are in the national interest. But if she is going to stick doggedly to the position that she outlined in her Mansion speech earlier in the year, which is out the single market, out the customs union, the hardest of possible hard Brexits, then frankly they don't even need to bother lifting the phone because we're not interested in helping them with that.
Okay, Alistair Carmichael, thank you very much indeed. So of course the politics has changed completely. The traditions here, many of them are the same, but things will be very different here in the next few months.
Vicki, thanks very much. We'll be back with you in a short while. Why don't we just see what progress the Crown is making as it's being brought from Buckingham Palace to the Palace of Westminster. Let's have a look. Some great views of the area around Westminster today, thanks to the very warm weather and the clear skies. And there we have the unmistakable hulk of Westminster Abbey, with the Palace of Westminster, and then St Margaret's Church just tucked behind the Abbey there, and of course the Treasury and the Foreign Office in Downing Street, Minister of Defence there on the top right of the frame. So that's a great view of Whitehall, and the Cenotaph very prominent in the centre of Whitehall there. And I think very soon we will see the cars emerging from Birdcage Walk, that's right, and turning left around Parliament Square past the statues of Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George, and about to turn into the Palace of Westminster. So, if you're just joining us for our special coverage of the state opening of Parliament following the general election, we have a slightly different ceremonial arrangement this year before we get to hear the Queen's speech, because this year there are no great carriage processions. It's been a very busy ceremonial time, the armed forces not having time to rehearse for quite a few state events. We had the Queen's birthday parade, of course, on Saturday, Trooping the Colour. So what we have this year is a slightly different, more modest arrangement, if you like, with cars, not carriages, and no horses in the procession, no sovereign's escort. So this is the first of the section of cars coming, delivering the crown. The crown, of course, normally just seen at coronations and at the state opening of Parliament. It is the imperial state crown. The crown will be very visible in Parliament, and there's our first good glimpse of it. And the officer accompanying the crown is Sir Andrew Ford, formerly of the Welsh Guards, but is now a very senior figure at Buckingham Palace, who looks after lots of the state ceremonial. And they turn into the sovereign's escort of the Palace of Westminster. So Martin Swift is the crown jeweller, and he's on hand to make sure that the crown is brought out safely and securely. And then it'll be taken by Sir Andrew into the regalia room. Now, that's a little room that's tucked away at the base of the Victoria Tower. Crown jeweller just waiting there for Lieutenant Colonel Ford, whose duty it is to look after the crown at all times. And he will now make his way up that flight of steps into the regalia room. And following that car, we have the other two great symbols of the sovereign's authority: Sword of State and the Cap of Maintenance. The Cap of Maintenance having been brought by Alexandra Scully, who's the Deputy Controller at the Lord Chamberlain's office, and the Sword of State being brought to the palace by General Sir Kevin O'Donoghue, who's Gentleman Usher to the Sword of State. And when the three are ready, these three great symbols of sovereignty, prime among them, of course, the imperial state crown, will be taken into the palace itself, accompanied by the gentlemen at arms. So the regalia being taken into the little room there before they're brought out again, ready for the procession and being put on display in the Royal Gallery. Let's look at the House of Lords, which is now packed with peers. Hundreds of them, but not enough seats for the 800 or so who are members of the House of Lords. Let's take a look and see if we can spot a few people. Well, there we have someone who knows Parliament very well. In the centre, that is Derek Foster, who was the Chief Whip for Labour for many years, the former MP for Bishop Auckland. Lord Foster now, who's Chief Whip under Neil Kinnock, and saw the Parliamentary Party going through some rather turbulent times. And then to the left we have Lord Levine, a former Lord Mayor of London, and a few other familiar faces too. We have David Willits, one of the great thinkers of the modern Conservative Party. And then a reminder of how things have changed, because there was a time, of course, when the Lord High Chancellor was a very, very powerful position. I'm not saying it's not powerful today, but it was much more powerful in the past. Lord Mackay also there in the House of Lords. Back to the royal staircase, and the imperial state crown now being brought up to the Royal Gallery. I'm always asked by viewers at this point to describe the crown in a little more detail. So let me tell you, there are 2,868 diamonds in this crown, 273 pearls, 17 sapphires, 11 emeralds, and 5 rubies. Originally made for Queen Victoria's coronation by the Crown Jewellers at that time, Rundle, Bridge and Rundle. Then, of course, adjusted since for other sovereigns. This crown only seen at the state opening and at the coronation of the monarch. Sir Andrew's transferred the crown now to the Marquis of Cholmondeley, who's the Lord Great Chamberlain. He's the man who's in charge of the royal parts of the Palace of Westminster. He has jurisdiction over those parts, and the crown is now on display, a symbol of the sovereign's power before the Queen arrives to open Parliament. And the Sword of State and the Cap of Maintenance will also be put on display in the Royal Gallery. When the procession happens a little later, these gentlemen will not be in that procession, because the Sword of State will be carried by Lord Boyce, Admiral of the Fleet, and by the Leader of the House of Lords. The Cap of Maintenance will be carried by Baroness Evans of Bowes Park. So they will feature in the procession a little later on. So the regalia safely delivered to the Royal Gallery and now on display, and they'll be moved a little later on ready for the procession, which will take place in about 20 minutes' time. Let's take another look at what's going on over at Buckingham Palace, because we should be seeing the Queen's departure relatively soon. It'll be a few minutes yet, I think, but it's good to get our bearings once again. Quite a big crowd there, probably there for changing the guard. Outside Buckingham Palace, it's 10 past 11 in the morning, and quite soon we'll see the Queen and the Prince of Wales travelling to Westminster. So just a few minutes on display there in the Royal Gallery, and now the Marquis of Cholmondeley is going to transfer the crown to the robing room. That's just over on the left, where it will be held ready for the Queen's arrival. The state trumpeters on either side of the great doorway into the robing room, ready to sound the start of the royal procession a little later on. Meanwhile, next door, in the Prince's chamber, the gentlemen-at-arms, the other corps of royal bodyguards, taking their positions. It's quite rare for us, actually, to be able to film inside the Prince's chamber, because normally it's difficult to get some cameras in there, so at least we've got a good sense of it. And there, if we just look, we just caught a glimpse of the portrait of Anne Boleyn there. There are lots of portraits from the Tudor period. The Garter King of Arms, Thomas Woodcock, appointed in 2010, in charge of the heraldry. He's the senior herald. Normally he's accompanied by a dozen colleagues, but again, the ceremony this year not quite as comprehensive as it has been in the past. And there we have Black Rod, who will be quite a prominent actor in this ceremony later. I'll tell you a little more about him later. Is there, and so is the Duke of Norfolk. This is the gentleman just on the left of frame here who's chatting. He is also one of the great officers of state. He is in charge of organising coronations and state weddings and funerals. Marquis of Cholmondeley there on the left-hand side, who is in charge of the royal sections of the palace, who will be greeting the Queen when she arrives, and Sir Andrew Ford, the gentleman we saw who brought the crown to the palace a short while ago. Let's take another look inside the chamber of the House of Lords. And at this point, and I'll bring in Laura here as well, at this point, Laura, where we see lots of those people who featured in previous governments and, of course, in previous parliaments. David Steele, for example, such an experienced parliamentarian, former Liberal leader, played such a prominent role in British politics. David Chidgey next to him, one of the famous by-election victors for the Lib Dems in years gone by. Just a thought, Laura, at this point about the role of this chamber coming up as well, because, you know, there's Lord Strathclyde, a former leader of the House of Lords. This chamber will also assume immense significance in the years ahead.
Indeed, and the role of the House of Lords was one of the reasons why Theresa May felt compelled to go for a general election. It was one of the Conservatives' anxiety as they looked ahead to the challenges of getting Brexit legislation through. They could not necessarily be confident that the House of Lords would back down on various issues, that whether or not the Lords would let the government have its way over Brexit, and the importance of the desire to have Brexit legislation in the Tory manifesto is, of course, because the House of Lords, in the end, does not resist government plans if they're in the manifesto. But, of course, they didn't get to that position, so the House of Lords is just as powerful as it was before the election.
Indeed. And when we talk about the power of the House of Lords, we have to look at this gentleman. This is Lord Fowler, who'll be familiar to lots of our viewers as Norman Fowler, Sir Norman Fowler, in times gone by, the former chairman of the Conservative Party. He is now the Lord Speaker. He was elected for a 5-year term by the House of Lords to be the Speaker of the House of Lords, a position created by the Blair government a decade ago, replacing the traditional, very powerful role of the Lord High Chancellor. So Lord Fowler will be a central figure where it comes to managing the business of the House of Lords and managing, Laura, this immense mountain of legislation.
Indeed, and he, of course, like so many Conservatives sitting in the House of Lords today, will have their own very vivid memories of the years during which the Tory party tore itself apart over European legislation. And of course, memories of Maastricht and those day-by-day votes through the early 90s when John Major was struggling to keep power. That will be absolutely on the minds of many Conservatives sitting in their ermine robes in the House of Lords today. It has been estimated that the Brexit bill, the repeal bill, will require 2,000 statutory instruments to go through the House of Lords. That's where, one way of passing legislation. A mammoth task.
The purse bearer there for the Lord High Chancellor, because that purse contains the speech, by the way, so that's a rather important purse. That is Ushma Patel, who's Diary Secretary to the Lord Chancellor. Lord Chancellor there is David Lidington, appointed very, very recently after the election, someone who was a very long-standing Minister for Europe, a very strong campaigner for remaining in the European Union. So David Lidington is now the Lord Chancellor, having succeeded Liz Truss, who had a rather turbulent time in that post. And he's now also joined the company at the head of that staircase to talk to those while they wait for the Sovereign to appear.
I think he did actually just open the purse to see if the speech was in there and seemed to have a bit of a giggle and rather a sigh of relief to see that it was.
They checked and they've had a little joke about it. I'm assuming they're quite relaxed, OK? Now, I mentioned earlier that in the procession itself, the Sword of State will be carried by Admiral the Lord Boyce, and the Cap of Maintenance will be carried by Baroness Evans of Bowes Park, who's the current leader of the House of Lords, and they've now arrived in the Royal Gallery in readiness for the Queen's arrival and for the procession to take place in a short while. The state trumpeters in place and the Yeomen of the Guard also providing a guard of honour for the Queen in the Royal Gallery. Baroness Evans, as leader of the Lords, Laura, will have more than her work cut out, I'd imagine.
Absolutely, and she's a relatively unknown member of the Cabinet, a relatively young politician, somebody who had been a Tory staffer for years until Theresa May put her into this position as leader of the House of Lords. One of the interesting changes before the election was, viewers might remember, under David Cameron and George Osborne, the relationship between the government and the Lords had become extremely hostile. Kill motions were being put down, the government being defeated frequently. One of the things that we had seen before the election is a bit of a sort of easing off of the tensions, particularly Baroness Evans and also Baroness Smith, the Labour leader of the Lords, Angela Smith, former Labour minister, had actually moved some way together to be working in a more collaborative way. The relationship was very different. But this election resets everything. And we just don't know yet whether or not the upper chamber is going to be extremely hostile or whether Baroness Evans does manage to keep a lid on things, because Parliament, both chambers, has so much more power now than they did before the executive. I mean, that is what, before the election, Theresa May's gamble was to strengthen the power of the executive. It failed, and now Parliament, and of course her party, is going to be much more involved in calling the shots. And that previous Brexit approach of hers, very rigid, having to be dragged to Parliament to answer questions, having to be pushed into publishing a white paper of Brexit plans, that many people inside the Tory party believe, and of course right across the opposition parties too, that approach is going to have to change if she wants to survive. Now, it's been interesting overnight, the briefed remarks that we expect from Theresa May will include a promise of humility. Whether that becomes real in terms of the actions of government is a different question.
At Buckingham Palace, the Queen is leaving on the way to the Palace of Westminster for this state opening of Parliament following the general election of June 2017. The Queen today accompanied by the Prince of Wales, because as we've mentioned previously, Duke of Edinburgh sadly taken ill last night and is in hospital being treated for an infection. Precautionary, say the Palace, and the Queen will certainly not be missing Royal Ascot this afternoon. The Duke of Edinburgh said to be sad to be missing the state opening and indeed his visit to Royal Ascot as well. So in lovely sunshine, the Queen in the Royal Bentley today, not in the horse-drawn carriage, not accompanied by the great sight of the household cavalry providing the sovereign's escort. None of that today. We are following the Royal Bentley, and then in the following car we have the Lady-in-Waiting, and then we have the private secretary of the Queen, private secretary to the Prince of Wales, and the equerry-in-waiting too. So this is the second of the section of royal cars making their ways through Birdcage Walk there. Glorious greenery all around St James's Park, a long Birdcage Walk up towards Parliament Square, where they too will arrive at the Sovereign's entrance of the Palace of Westminster in just a few moments' time. Let's take a look inside the Palace, in the central lobby, because what I'd like to show you is just a little taste, really, of what's to come, because we're expecting the Speaker's procession, another important procession taking place before the Queen's speech happens. This is where Mr. Speaker, John Bercow, who was re-elected recently to the position of Speaker, he will process with his officers and his chaplain through the central lobby and make their way to the chamber of the House of Commons. Cry of Speaker. Very soon, Sergeant Duncan Anderson will tell us
hats off, strangers!
That everyone should take their hats off. Strangers referring, by the way, to those in times gone by who were not members of Parliament and not part of the parliamentary staff. There's the Speaker with his team. And here we have the Queen arriving at the Palace of Westminster. So the Queen has arrived at the Palace of Westminster, and soon the Union flag will be taken down and the royal standard will be broken above the palace, just to signal that the Queen is present. And that should happen. Oh, there we have. Rather slowly, but it's happening. And inside the palace, the royal staircase, members of the royal party passing the detachment of the household cavalry, the Queen sensibly having used the lift and making her way into the robing room. And we'll see the Duke of Norfolk waiting there to greet Her Majesty and the Prince of Wales. accompanied by Black Rod and the Marquis of Cholmondeley. Prince of Wales exchanging a few words there with the Duke of Norfolk, probably about the slightly adjusted arrangements for the day. So safely in the robing room, no cameras in there, as I mentioned. So very soon, the next thing we'll see will be the Queen and the Prince of Wales ready to process through the Royal Gallery. And in the procession, the crown will be carried by the Marquis of Cholmondeley, Lord Great Chamberlain, into the Chamber of the House of Lords. Procession already assembling now near the door to the robing room. It'll be led by the gentleman usher of the Black Rod. We saw him just a while ago, and he is the one who will be dispatched to summon MPs to the House of Lords. That's Lieutenant General David Leakey, who's been in the post now for several years. He's a familiar figure on these days. I think it's probably worth staying in the Royal Gallery at this point, because very soon the state trumpeters will be given the signal to announce the start of the procession. Staff Corporal Matthew Screen of the Blues and Royals, Trumpet Major, and Lance Corporal of Horse Sanford of the Life Guards. They are the state trumpeters today. Just a moment of silence now in the Royal Gallery as we wait for the signal that the Queen is ready for the procession to begin. Procession itself, when it happens, will look quite familiar in many ways because lots of the key players will take part in it. But there'll be fewer, for example, leaders of the armed forces. There'll be Sir Stuart Peach, the Air Chief Marshal, for example, but some of his colleagues will not be there. We'll have the Yeomen of the Guard and the Gentlemen at Arms also represented, the private secretaries to the Queen and to the Prince of Wales. And of course, the Lord President of the Council, Andrea Leadsom, who was appointed just recently, former Environment Secretary. She will feature her first big ceremonial day as Lord President of the Council and Leader of the House of Commons, another onerous task when you think of the mountain of legislation to come. The Lord Speaker, Lord Fowler, will also take part in the procession, but the Commons Speaker, of course, is in the House of Commons, waiting for Black Rod, just on the left there, David Leakey, to be sent down to summon the members of the House of Commons. With the famous knock on the door of the House of Commons, the doors will be slammed in his face, just to remind people that the House of Commons guards its powers very jealously. And then the Sword of State, the Cap of Maintenance too. The imperial state crown, preceding the Queen and the Prince of Wales in this procession through the Royal Gallery for the state opening of Parliament 2017. The Lord Great Chamberlain, it's his task to carry the crown today in a different kind of ceremony to the ones we've seen in the past. procession being led by the Garter King of Arms, Thomas Woodcock, and by Blackrod, and followed there by the Duke of Norfolk, and then by the two other emblems of the sovereign's power, the Cap of Maintenance and the Sword of State. The Lady-in-Waiting, Lady Susan Hussey, and then Lord-in-Waiting, Lord Young of Cookham, and the Chief of the Defence Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Stuart Peach. Passing through the Prince's Chamber now, Gentlemen-at-Arms providing the guard of honour there, and into the Grand Chamber of the House of Lords. Table has been provided for the Crown to rest on it for the duration of the Queen's speech. The Queen will soon signal that Her Majesty is ready for the Commons to be summoned.
My Lords, pray be seated.
So the signal has been given, and Lieutenant General David Leakey, Blackrod, is being announced as he makes his way along from the House of Lords, through the central lobby of the Houses of Parliament, down to the House of Commons, through the members' lobby, where he's greeted by quite a few members, and then into the chamber, but there will be a little obstacle before he can get in. His way into the chamber. Will there be a contribution from the veteran Labour MP Dennis Skinner today? Let's see.
You were right on his butt again, mate.
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands this honourable House to attend Her Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
Yeah, get your skates on. First race is 2:30.
So that's the scene in the House of Commons. Mr. Skinner with an eye on Royal Ascot, clearly, and Blackrod now making his way along with the Speaker to the bar, as it's known, the bar of the House of Lords. That is the area where the MPs will gather. Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn walking together. And this, Laura, is quite an interesting point for us because we always have a bit of fun studying the body language, don't we? So let's have a look to see Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn. Any warm conversation going on?
It doesn't look like it, does it? They both seem to be rather determinedly looking in different directions. It's always quite fun to speculate whether they're talking about the weather or talking about the politics ahead, but it looked there like they didn't actually even exchange a single word.
Well, Boris Johnson and Emily Thornberry having a nice warm chat, clearly.
Indeed.
Slightly different, but...
Yep. The two principals. Oh, there we go. There's a little word. She's trying to make conversation. But what different political prospects they had both expected to be returning to today. This should have been Theresa May being crowned the political queen. That's what the Tories expected. Instead, she, as one of her colleagues rather unkindly described her, a wounded antelope, with a decision about her prospects very much firmly in the hands of her party, not herself.
Is that being overdone, Brandon?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I've picked up colleagues generally is that they think Theresa May is the right person to be not just the leader of our party, but the Prime Minister. And let's remember, she got us the biggest vote share our party has seen since 1983. That in itself is quite an achievement. We would all like a better outcome, obviously, in terms of the number of seats, but let's not underestimate the success of actually that kind of level of votes, and 800,000 more than any other party.
For now, however, Minister, I mean, you cannot deny that all the talk among colleagues is about at what point she will have to go, what would be the correct exit for her. The one thing it seems to me that Conservatives can agree on is that she will not be the leader going into the next general election, whenever that may be. You can't deny those conversations are taking place.
I think one of the things we've all learned in politics in the last year or so is you can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone next year. I think it's important that we get behind the Prime Minister and take government forward.
So the Speaker has led MPs into the House of Lords, and very soon the Lord Chancellor will have to delve into that great purse and retrieve the speech and present it to Her Majesty, so that Her Majesty can deliver the Queen's speech with its mention of the legislative plans for the next couple of years. Speaker there with the Sergeant-at-Arms, Kamal El-Haji, and the Lord Chancellor, David Lidington, prepares to offer the speech.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's priority is to secure the best possible deal as the country leaves the European Union. My ministers are committed to working with Parliament, the devolved administrations, business and others to build the widest possible consensus on the country's future outside the European Union. A bill will be introduced to repeal the European Communities Act and provide certainty for individuals and businesses. This will be complemented by legislation to ensure that the United Kingdom makes a success of Brexit, establishing new national policies on immigration, international sanctions, nuclear safeguards, agriculture and fisheries. My government will seek to maintain a deep and special partnership with the European allies and to forge new trading relationships across the globe. New bills on trade and customs will help to implement an independent trade policy, and support will be given to help British businesses export to markets around the world. My ministers will strengthen the economy so that it supports the creation of jobs and generates the tax revenues needed to invest in the National Health Service, schools and other public services. My government will continue to improve the public finances while keeping taxes low. It will spread prosperity and opportunity across the country through a new modern industrial strategy. My government will work to attract investment in infrastructure to support economic growth. Legislation will be introduced to ensure the United Kingdom remains a world leader in new industries, including electric cars and commercial satellites. A new bill will also be brought forward to deliver the next phase of high-speed rail. My government will continue to work to ensure that every child has the opportunity to attend a good school and that all schools are fairly funded. My ministers will work to ensure people have the skills they need for the high-skilled, high-wage jobs of the future, including through a major reform of technical education. The national living wage will be increased so that people who are on the lowest pay benefit from the same improvements in earnings as higher paid workers. My ministers will seek to enhance rights and protections in the modern workplace. My government will make further progress to tackle the gender pay gap and discrimination against people on the basis of their race, faith, gender, disability or sexual orientation. Legislation will be brought forward to protect the victims of domestic violence and abuse. My government will reform mental health legislation and ensure that mental health is prioritised in the National Health Service in England. Proposals will be brought forward to ban unfair tenant fees, promote fairness and transparency in the housing market, and help ensure more homes are built. My ministers will work to improve social care and will bring forward proposals for consultation. My government will ensure fairer markets for consumers. This will include bringing forward measures to help tackle unfair practices in the energy market to help reduce energy bills. A priority will be to build a more united country, strengthening the social, economic and cultural bonds between England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. My government will work in cooperation with the devolved administrations, and it will work with all of the parties in Northern Ireland to support the return of devolved government. A new law will ensure that the United Kingdom retains its world-class regime protecting personal data, and proposals for a new digital charter will be brought forward to ensure that the United Kingdom is the safest place to be online. Legislation will also be introduced to modernise the court system and to help reduce motor insurance premiums. My government will initiate a full public inquiry into the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower to ascertain the causes and ensure that the appropriate lessons are learnt. To support victims, my government will take forward measures to introduce an independent public advocate who will act for bereaved families after a public disaster and support them at public inquests. My ministers will continue to invest in our gallant armed forces, meeting the NATO commitment to spend at least 2% of national income on defence, and delivering on the Armed Forces Covenant across the United Kingdom. My government will bring forward proposals to ensure that critical national infrastructure is protected to safeguard national security. A commission for countering extremism will be established to support the government in stamping out extremist ideology in all its forms, both across society and on the internet, so it is denied a safe space to spread. In the light of the terrorist attacks in Manchester and London, my government's counter-terrorism strategy will be reviewed to ensure that the police and security services have all the powers they need, and that the length of custodial sentences for terrorism-related offences are sufficient to keep the population safe. My ministers will ensure that the United Kingdom's leading role on the world stage is maintained and enhanced as it leaves the European Union. As a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, committed to spending 0.7% of national income on international development, my government will continue to drive international efforts that increase global security and project British values around the world. My government will work to find sustainable political solutions to conflicts across the Middle East. It will work to tackle the threat of terrorism at source by continuing the United Kingdom's leading role in international military action to destroy Daesh in Iraq and Syria. It will also lead efforts to reform the international system to improve the United Kingdom's ability to tackle mass migration, alleviate poverty, and end modern slavery. My government will continue to support international action against climate change, including the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Prince Philip and I look forward to welcoming Their Majesties King Felipe and Queen Letizia of Spain on a state visit in July. My government will host the Commonwealth Summit in April of next year to cement its relevance to this and future generations. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
So Her Majesty has completed the speech, and the Lord Chancellor now places it back in the Lord Chancellor's purse. Which means that the procession now will make its way back through the Prince's Chamber, through the Royal Gallery and back into the robing room, ready for the Queen's departure in a short while. So the Crown heading the procession again, and that was the 64th time that the Queen has delivered the speech to open Parliament. It's a remarkable statistic. The Queen, who celebrated her 91st birthday earlier this year, and of course the official birthday celebrated last Saturday at the Queen's Birthday Parade, trooping the colour on Horse Guards not far from Westminster. It's been a very busy ceremonial season. The procession making its way past that great statue of Queen Victoria, and the Prince of Wales accompanying the Queen, given the Duke of Edinburgh's illness and the fact that he's been treated in hospital since last night for the infection, a precautionary measure, says Buckingham Palace today. This is the first state opening of its kind without the full ceremonial complement since March of 1974. That too followed an unexpected general election where the Conservative Edward Heath went to the country and lost his majority. There were two general elections in 1974. People wondering whether that may well be the case in 2017. We shall see. So as they make their way back into the robing room, the members of the House of Commons who'd been summoned to the House of Lords will of course very soon be making their way back to the House of Commons. Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn, Damien Green, the First Secretary of State, very senior member of the government now, and Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary too. Speaker's chaplain there just on the right-hand side. And a good moment, Laura, for us to just pick up, and we're counting 27 bills and draft bills, a combination of 27 bills and draft bills, which sounds like quite a lot, but clearly the bulk of that is lots to do with Brexit.
Absolutely.
And I'm just wondering to what extent they'll be able to squeeze lots of other things in.
I think the prospects for other bits and pieces of legislation are fairly grim, I have to say. I mean, 8 of the bills out of the 27 bills and draft bills are related to Brexit in one way or another. Of course, some of the other bills that are in there are also hangovers from the last Parliament, so continuations of things that have gone before. I mean, if you like, Brexit is the flesh, everything else seems to be rather a skeleton, and the Tory manifesto has basically been filleted to have all of its most controversial parts have just simply not appeared in this Queen's speech, whether that was the so-called dementia tax or the clear promise of a cap on energy bills. The things that looked like they would be politically difficult have gone, they've disappeared. And just as we saw Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn leave there, it was really as if she was grinning and bearing it, he was just grinning.
So, not wasting any time, it has to be said, the Royal Party, the Prince of Wales and Her Majesty, are now leaving the palace. Just thanking some of the key members of the ceremony today, including the Lord Speaker there, Lord Fowler, Prince of Wales too. And of course, once the Queen has left with the Prince of Wales, we'll then also see the crown and the other regalia being taken away too. All of that then, of course, will just really signal the starting point of several days of debate on the content of the Queen's speech itself, which is when we get into the real politics of all of this. And just looking at the final sort of conversations going on here before the Queen leaves, and then we'll pick up again in a couple of seconds with what those permutations might be within Parliament in terms of the Commons and the Lords with the legislation that's coming up, and indeed what the selection tells us. Laura's already been mentioning some of the things that are in, and indeed significantly some of the things that are not listed in the Queen's speech today. Question now, of course, is will the lift be used? But maybe it's not being used. So I think the answer is yes. So the royal staircase, just to the right-hand side where we have the Household Cavalry standing by, and they've been smartly providing that guard of honour today. And back in the Royal Gallery, gentlemen-at-arms having taken their position now in the Royal Gallery, ready for the final stage of this ceremony of the state opening. And then in the Sovereign's entrance, preparations being made for the Queen's departure. The Garter King of Arms and the Duke of Norfolk and Black Rod. And just a couple of seconds, I think, before the Royal Bentley appears once again. And the journey back to the palace, a rather swifter one than the usual one in the great horse-drawn carriages. First Battalion Coldstream Guards providing the Guard of Honour, and the band of the Coldstream Guards too, hard at work outside the Palace of Westminster, and the Royal Standard now being taken down and replaced by the Union flag. And looking at that Union flag, Laura, with all of its resonance, of course, certainly in terms of Northern Ireland, I want to pick up on that theme in just a second, because we've just got the Crown departing here. Now this is Sir Andrew Ford, back at work, looking after the Imperial State Crown, taking through the Royal Gallery and out of the Palace of Westminster, along with the Sword of State and the Cap of Maintenance. the Household Cavalry detachment of lifeguards and Blues and Royals, standing to attention for the departure of the Crown. And once this final part of the formal ceremony is completed, the lively political debate can then begin. Crown jeweller Martin Swift carefully placing the crown into the state car. The crown is departing. Probably waiting for the two other important elements of the regalia, the sword and the cap. And then they will then travel in convoy. The sword of state being taken back by General Sir Kevin O'Donoghue, and the cap of maintenance there by Mr. Alexander Scully. He'll be in charge of it. He's the Deputy Comptroller at the Lord Chamberlain's office at Buckingham Palace. So the formalities have been completed, and the crown and the other items of regalia are now leaving the Palace of Westminster, and it's time for us to get some reaction to the content of the speech. And I suppose one of the things I wanted to pick up with Laura, and I mentioned the Union flag there for a second, of course all of this depending on Northern Ireland and the DUP. And I'm wondering whether we have any more developments on that today.
Well, behind all this perfectly choreographed ceremony, of course, there are some very real cut and thrust of hard politics going on. We do now know a bit more about what the DUP is trying to demand. Sources have suggested to the BBC this morning that they are up front asking for £1 billion extra for the health service in Northern Ireland and an equivalent amount for infrastructure in Northern Ireland. And they're also trying to put significant pressure on in terms of defence spending, which for a long time has been a priority for the DUP. Now, of course, for the other parties, particularly for the SNP, but also for everybody else involved in trying to put this Parliament together, making such demands, one wonders if it will be seen as being quite acceptable of the DUP to do this. Now, clearly on both sides, as we were saying before, for the Conservatives and for the DUP, the incentive is to do this deal, but it's certainly playing hardball.
I'll come to the Minister in a moment. There we have the scene in Whitehall for you, Parliament Square, bathed in sunshine today. Again, very, very warm day in central London and, of course, in other parts of the UK too. So the crown is on its way. And let me bring in my guests once again, Yvette Cooper for Labour and Joanna Cherry for the Scottish National Party, and for the Conservatives, the Home Office Minister, Brandon Lewis. I'll come to the Minister in a second. Thoughts, first of all, on the content and what you made of it, Yvette?
So obviously provision for a lot of Brexit legislation, but we've got no idea what the content of that legislation is yet going to be, and it could take some time to even find out. and very little on other issues, particularly on the serious crisis that is affecting our public services. We've had Mark Rowley today warning about the impact on policing, the scale of cuts that they've had to deal with when they're overstretched. We've got the NHS making cuts to treatments and to services. And for schools, we've got head teachers warning that they're going to have to cut subjects or cut the school day. We've had 7 years of this Conservative austerity, and I think this was a very big factor in the general election and why Theresa May did not get the majority that she wanted, and yet we've seen no recognition of that as part of the Queen's speech today. I think this is immensely serious. The government cannot think it can just simply carry on as if the election didn't happen without responding to the serious crisis in our public services and the need for more investment, not simply from Northern Ireland. I can understand why the DUP would be asking for more investment in the public services, but actually for England, for Scotland, for Wales, the whole country needs the investment in public services that so far Theresa May and the government seem to be just denying is needed.
We'll put those points to the Minister. Joanna, your perspective?
Well, I am worried that it sounds like the government's still very much heading for a hard Brexit. We've heard the same tired old language, securing the best deal possible, but no detail in what that means. The speech says that the government are committed to working with the devolved governments and business, but we need action on this, not words. There have been meetings with devolved governments, but no attempt to take on board our very sensible proposals to prevent Britain going off a cliff edge with a hard Brexit. Now, business supports the Scottish Government in wanting a place at the negotiating table. Business in Scotland wants the Scottish Government to have a place at the negotiating table. Business in Scotland also supports the Scottish Government's call for immigration powers to be devolved to the Scottish Parliament because we have differential needs. What I want to see now from the government is listening and action on those demands. I was worried about the language that was used in relation to public finances, our approach to the public finances while still keeping taxes low. Theresa May needs to wake up and realise that she didn't win the election. She doesn't have a mandate for continued austerity policies. She doesn't have a mandate to keep making the poorest people in society pay for her way of doing things. And don't let's forget, the cost of Brexit is going to be massive. Who's going to pay for that? This speech worries me that it will be her continued attempts to put the cost of these crazy plans on the backs of the poorest people in society with further welfare cuts and a continued refusal to look at helping the low paid by, for example, taking away the tax credit cuts imposed in the last Parliament.
Minister, can we deal with the public services point and Yvette's point first of all, which police numbers? I mean, you know all about policing as a former policing minister. I'm just wondering, are you able to give those assurances? And what does the Queen's speech do to reassure people who are concerned about the impact of police cuts?
Well, I think there's 3 parts to the Queen's speech, and I'll deal directly with the police cuts. But the Queen's speech itself looks at what we need to do in order to deliver Brexit, which is clearly something we have to do, the country voted on. But it's also about delivering that economic prosperity and fairness through society. Now, on police numbers, we've obviously protected police spending, and actually in the counter-terrorism area, we're seeing an increase of some 30% over the next few years. It's already been increasing since 2010, but we're always going to keep a focus on that. The Queen's speech itself outlines that look at counter-terrorism, how we deal with that, and counter-extremism, and that work's going to be hugely important going forward. But we also, and coming back to Joanna's point, in terms of the language in there, I think we need to be very upfront, and we've always been very honest about the fact this isn't about a particular policy or another, this is about living within our means. And if we don't live within our means as a country, we go back to the problems we saw before 2010, we end up creating more debt, and that's more pressure on young people as they get older.
So austerity carries on.
We've got to live within our means and be sensible with the country's finances.
Does it mean that, though? Does it mean austerity as a concept is still with us?
Well, I don't look at it that way. I look at it about being efficient with the taxpayers' money, so that we make sure that some of the lowest earners in the country, increasing the living wage, increasing that level before you pay income tax, which has taken 4 million people out of income tax, meant the lowest paid people in this country are doing better than ever before, whilst the highest paid are paying more than ever before. That's a fair society.
A little break. I want to go and get some more reaction from Vicki, and then we'll be back with our panel here. Vicki?
And MPs here getting used to a very different political landscape to the one that they left a few weeks ago. Let's discuss that a bit more. I'm joined by Jacob Rees-Mogg from the Tories and Mary Cray for Labour. Mary, first of all, we are in a different political landscape. Brexit is going to dominate. It dominates this Queen's speech. What is Labour going to do? How are you going to approach all of this?
Well, I think what we saw today is a pretty thin Queen's speech. It was very weak on Brexit, I thought, but it was also weak on the causes of Brexit. We had no real domestic agenda, and this is the result of having a Prime Minister in office but not in power, at the mercy of the DUP, asking for extra funding for Northern Ireland schools and hospitals, and a Prime Minister who is saying that she won't deliver that to schools and hospitals at home. I'm very clear that she didn't win the general election because of her record on public services, policing, schools and hospitals, and really people feeling that they're in competition with each other for those public services. So, it's a very, very weak Queen's speech, very thin on the ground and very little change. The Tory manifesto, all of the domestic proposals are essentially dead in the water.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, on the issue of this possible deal with the DUP, it looks like it's been delayed for some reason or another. They are demanding certain things. What do you make of that as a Conservative backbencher?
Well, the DUP are very experienced in these sorts of negotiations. That's how Northern Ireland politics works, and they obviously want to get their terms met. But I think it's worth answering some of the points on public expenditure that Mary was making, because there is more money for schools, there is more money for hospitals. That was in the Conservative manifesto, it was in the Queen's speech. There is a strong domestic agenda. Housing was at the forefront of the Queen's speech. But of course, Brexit will dominate because we need to have laws in place that cover things that were EU competencies once we leave.
And does the election result mean that it's a different kind of Brexit? Maybe a long transition period? Maybe being in some kind of customs union?
I think we've got to be out of the customs union, because if we stay in the customs union, we don't get the benefits of leaving, which could be cheaper food, cheaper clothing, cheaper footwear. Really beneficial to people's standards of living, real opportunity for the government to get. And so I don't think it changes Brexit, because during the election, the Labour Party didn't campaign against Brexit. They campaigned on public expenditure. And in that context, we've got to live within our means, whatever else we do.
So, Mary Craig, that is the point, isn't it? You are someone who was very much on the Remain side. Your constituency, though, was very much on the Leave side. Don't Labour MPs have a duty to deliver Brexit now?
I think we do, but Jacob's totally wrong. The Labour Party's position was to remain in the European Union, and the fantasy which is put out by Jacob and his colleagues that we were going to stay in the customs union, stay in the single market. When the Prime Minister says no deal is better than a bad deal, we're seeing in that Queen's speech actually she wants a deal, and the warnings from the motor industry, from the Bank of England, Mark Carney, are showing us that we will be worse off if we don't stay at least in the customs union. We need to protect our industry.
The Labour Party manifesto did not say stay in the European Union. It accepted the vote last year to leave, accepted we were leaving the single market, and implied but didn't state explicitly that we would leave the customs union.
OK, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Mary Craig, thank you very much indeed. And of course that debate gets underway this afternoon. The crucial vote, though, won't come until next week.
Vicki, thanks very much. Thanks to your guests too. We've just got a few minutes left. I'm just having another look at the content of the speech. No mention of a state visit by President Trump. Quick comment on that?
Well, there's been an offer extended and accepted. There's no date set yet, and that's why it's not in the Queen's speech.
So there's nothing. So it could.
I wouldn't read too much.
This year.
I wouldn't read anything into that other than because there's not a date set. It can't be in the Queen's speech.
So do you expect it to happen this year?
Well, that's a matter of them working out the diaries with the President, but the offer's been made, it's been accepted, it's just a matter of working out a date.
And then thank you very much, on the counter-terrorism strategy, it says this will be reviewed to ensure that police and security services have all the powers they need. So this is not just to do with resources and numbers and money, all the powers they need.
Yeah.
What should we read into that?
Well, one of the things that was talked about over the last few weeks, actually, by the Prime Minister, for example, the sentencing as well around people who have committed terror crimes. At the moment, some of those low-level crimes have low-level sentencing, and looking at actually making that much tougher to give a very clear message that in no way is any form of linking to terrorism going to be accepted in society.
Some thoughts, Laura?
Well, that's one of the things that Theresa May sort of threw on the table at the very last moment in the general election. You'll remember after the London attacks and the Manchester attacks, almost the day before, she made quite a significant intervention, promising that if she won on Thursday, on Friday, she would set about the task of toughening up our anti-terror measures in this country. But my goodness, over there in Parliament, these kinds of things are controversial. Now, of course, it's a huge issue of great sensitivity for the public, but any attempt to crank up the apparatus of the state around confronting terrorism will, in a hung Parliament, be something extremely controversial. There were suggestions that they might return to something more like control orders, which of course were scrapped when Theresa May was Home Secretary. But clearly this is an issue of very significant concern, but something that would be very bumpy across the road.
Where does Labour stand on that, Yvette?
Well, look, the government announced a counter-extremism bill in the 2015 Queen's Speech, and it never happened, and then in the 2016 Queen's Speech, and it never happened. It's not even clearly in this Queen's Speech, so I think we'll wait and respond. The most important thing, I think, in tackling terrorism now is to make sure that the police have the resources they need, which they are asking for, and that we've always supported, making sure they also have the powers they need. But in response to Brandon's point earlier that suggested that the reason the government can't do more to deal with this public services crisis, including in policing, was somehow that they don't have the money. They are still going ahead with billions of pounds of tax cuts for capital gains tax, corporation tax, inheritance tax for the richest in the country. There are choices that they could make, and they should be making those choices. We've got a hung Parliament now. If they don't make those choices, I think they will find it a much rockier time in Parliament, and rightly so, because this is not what the public voted for across the country. They didn't vote for the government to just carry on as if they didn't have an election.
What of it is missing out there is actually our policies around tax, and corporation tax is a really good example of this. Actually has increased the tax take. There is more corporation tax coming in now, more businesses growing and opening, and that's creating more jobs in the economy.
So
it is a very important policy as to the benefit to the taxpayer in terms of taxes into the Treasury and also jobs for people out of the country.
Brexit threatens jobs in the economy. The Fraser of Allender Institute in Scotland has said that Brexit threatens 80,000 jobs in Scotland. Now, the fact of the matter is that your austerity agenda, despite imposing austerity on the poorest in society, you haven't met any of your targets, your own self-imposed targets on debt, deficit or borrowing. The people of the United Kingdom don't want this austerity agenda any longer. Theresa May talked about humility earlier this morning. There's precious little sign of humility in a speech which goes on about a hard Brexit and seems to envisage continuing with the sort of austerity policies that you have described. If the country needs austerity, then it should fall on everyone's shoulders, not just the poorest. But the SNP have proposed alternative. The SNP have proposed alternative policies for modest investments in public services to grow the economy. You don't have a mandate for your austerity agenda. The time has come to recognise that and step back from it.
We are just at the end, Laura, because Joanna mentioned the humility theme. Just as a closing thought from you, what does that signal in terms of the months ahead?
Well, it signals that Theresa May knows she has to say that she will change her ways, that she will have to reach out inside her own party and also across Parliament if she has any chance of getting her plans through and staying in office. But of course, actions speak much louder than words.
Indeed. Thank you all for coming. Joanna and Yvette and Brandon and Laura, of course. Really good to have you with us today as we look at the new look, if you like, a new look state opening of Parliament. Thanks to all of you coming in. Thanks for watching, of course. Coverage of the debate on the Queen's Speech, and it's going to be a pretty lively one, will continue on the BBC News channel this afternoon. State opening of Parliament is concluded, but will it really be 2 years before the next one? It's a time of immense political challenge ahead. From all of the BBC team here at Westminster, thanks for watching and goodbye.
This is BBC News. I'm Simon McCoy, live from Westminster on the day the Queen sets out the government's plans in her speech to Parliament. This year's Queen's Speech, which covers a 2-year period instead of the usual 1 year, finally went ahead after it was postponed following the Grenfell Tower block fire. The main focus of the government's plans was Brexit, with the announcement of other proposals covering rental fees, domestic violence and car insurance. We'll bring you much more on that in the next few minutes, but first, just before the state opening of Parliament, Buckingham Palace issued a statement that the Duke of Edinburgh has been admitted to hospital as a precautionary measure. The Duke is to receive treatment for an infection arising from what officials called a pre-existing condition. Our correspondent Lisa Hampley is outside the King Edward VII Hospital in central London where the Duke of Edinburgh is being treated. Lisa, what more do we know about his condition?
Well, he was admitted last night as a precautionary measure. He has an infection, and as you say, that it has arisen out of a pre-existing condition, and there's speculation that it could be a bladder infection, but we haven't had that from the palace. That's just speculation. He was supposed to be accompanying the Queen at the state opening of Parliament, but now the Prince of Wales has taken his place. We've had a statement from Buckingham Palace that says the Duke of Edinburgh was admitted to King Edward VII Hospital in London last night as a precautionary measure for treatment for an infection arising from a pre-existing condition. Prince Phillip is in good spirits, they say, and he is disappointed to be missing the state opening of Parliament and Royal Ascot. And we also know that the Queen is going to Royal Ascot this afternoon, and she's been kept informed. And we've also been told that he is in good spirits and that he's up and about. And we know, don't we, that he's been very healthy for many years. He's just 96, and that he had exploratory surgery in June 2013 and recovered well from that surgery on his abdomen. He spent 11 days, the longest time in hospital was 11 days, and that included an intensive care. And also that in 2011 he had surgery for a blocked artery, and that was 2011. And we know, don't we, we remember in 2012 that flotilla where in the rain for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee celebrations he had an infection then. But apart from that, he's been very healthy, and as I say, we've had news that he is in good spirits and that he has been up and about.
Lisa, of course, he's already announced that he's cutting down on royal duties towards the end of the year. You have to say, if it hadn't been for the state opening of Parliament, at which he was due to attend next to the Queen, of course, his position for so many years, we perhaps would not have known that he'd gone into hospital last night.
Absolutely. It happened last night. We didn't know until about an hour ago. We do know that the Queen is going to Royal Ascot and that he had been looking forward to it. And in fact, he was there yesterday and looking pretty chirpy and pretty well. We also know that infections can come from not having enough water in hot weather. It's one of the things that is quite common when you become older, and especially in bad weather or very hot weather. It's all speculation. We don't know. We just know it's from a pre-existing condition. It was May the 4th when he retired from royal duties, and he's been the longest serving royal consort in British history, and he's a huge support for the Queen. And you can take it that she is going about her normal duties and going to Royal Ascot this afternoon and just being kept abreast of what happens.
Thank you very much. Lisa Hamperley, the King Edward VII Hospital. Obviously, we'll keep you up to date if there's any more announcement about the Duke's condition. Well, let's return now to the Queen's speech, which has set out the measures the government hopes to bring into law over the next 2 years. Let's just look at the main points. The main focus of the speech was Brexit. I knew I was going to do that one day. Brexit and the Great Repeal Bill, with the government claiming it wants to build the widest possible consensus. There were also proposals for new national legislation covering immigration, trade, agriculture and fisheries. There'll be a new counter-extremism commissioner to help tackle the growth of extremism in society and online. There'll be new measures to help deal with disasters, such as the fire at the Grenfell Tower block in London. Industry was also mentioned, with an announcement of new bills for investment in electric cars, the space industry and HS2. There'll be a new bill to help protect the victims of domestic violence. Mental health treatment will be prioritised within the NHS. There will be legislation to safeguard tenants from unfair rental fees. And there'll be a measure to encourage more house building. Well, our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, has been monitoring that. We'll be talking to him very shortly. In fact, I think he'll probably join. We'll talk to him in a moment. But first, let's just hear from the Queen giving the speech. It was much shorter, obviously, than usual, and she wasn't dressed in her finery, in her robes, because the snap election had changed the routine to the point where she had day dress, and, of course, not accompanied by the Duke of Edinburgh today. Let's just remind ourselves of what she told the House a short time ago.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's priority is to secure the best possible deal as the country leaves the European Union. My ministers are committed to working with Parliament, the devolved administrations, business and others to build the widest possible consensus on the country's future outside the European Union. A bill will be introduced to repeal the European Communities Act and provide certainty for individuals and businesses. This will be complemented by legislation to ensure that the United Kingdom makes a success of Brexit, establishing new national policies on immigration, international sanctions, nuclear safeguards, agriculture and fisheries. My government will seek to maintain a deep and special partnership with the European allies and to forge new trading relationships across the globe. New bills on trade and customs will help to implement an independent trade policy, and support will be given to help British businesses export to markets around the world. My ministers will strengthen the economy so that it supports the creation of jobs and generates the tax revenues needed to invest in the National Health Service, schools, and other public services. My government will continue to improve the public finances while keeping taxes low. It will spread prosperity and opportunity across the country through a new modern industrial strategy. My government will work to attract investment in infrastructure to support economic growth. Legislation will be introduced to ensure the United Kingdom remains a world leader in new industries, including electric cars and commercial satellites. A new bill will also be brought forward to deliver the next phase of high-speed rail.
Well, that was the Queen speaking a short time ago. Joining me now, Labour's Shadow Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Secretary Rebecca Long-Bailey. And it's a different environment here today, a new politics, if you like. What would Labour's approach be, having heard what the Tories are outlining?
Well, I mean, I think what we've heard today was a very weak and wobbly and vague speech from a Prime Minister who is very uncertain of her future. We've seen a lot of the manifesto commitments that they put in their manifesto rolled back on. Energy price cap, for example, wasn't referred to, just a vague reference to reforming the energy market. But Labour would certainly do things differently. We had a robust plan to reform our economy and society at large, and we saw very little in today's speech about the economy.
Well, when you say reform the economy, many of your critics are saying, well, you'd bankrupt it because you're making promises of spend, spend, spend.
No, that's not true at all. We had a fully costed manifesto that was discussed throughout the election period. We were the only party to have a fully costed manifesto, and we set out an industrial strategy that encouraged businesses to grow, thrive and prosper, not just by investing and encouraging private and public investment into infrastructure and industry, but also to set up the tools that businesses need, such as education and skills, and reforming the business rate system to make sure that businesses aren't on a cliff edge and that certain elements of plant and machinery are excluded from business rates, so that businesses can grow their businesses without a massive upfront cost. The government has set out no such plan today, and I think businesses will have a big question mark over their future if the current government continues.
Surely businesses, in fact, every person in this country is going to be talking about only one thing in the next few years, and that, of course, is Brexit. Isn't the government right to concentrate on that?
Well, we need to concentrate on Brexit, but we also need to make sure that our economy is in a robust shape going forward, and it certainly isn't. We haven't been investing in businesses to the extent that we need to. We're currently the lowest, or one of the lowest in the OECD in terms of investment in research and development, for example. That's not setting our economy up for the future. So we need to get the best Brexit deal, but as we exit Europe, we need to make sure that our economy is strong so that we are in a strong position as we find our way in the world.
You are clearly looking at a Prime Minister that you think is vulnerable. What are you going to do about that? Are you actually going to put in some amendments on the basis that if the Prime Minister then struggles in the House, things have to give somewhere?
Well, I think the speech was vague for a reason. Obviously, the talks between the DUP and the government are struggling at the moment, and she's very worried about whether she's going to get this Queen's speech passed. But there are issues that need to be dealt with as a matter of urgency, and the Labour Party will be focusing on those, and we will be putting forward our own amendments to deal with the issues that are at the foremost of people's minds at the moment. This speech hasn't done that.
How many amendments? What sort of things? Just talk me through them.
Well, there'll be a whole raft of amendments, and I'll have to keep you in suspense on that. It'll be very detailed, and I don't think we've got enough time in this interview to go through every single one.
Oh, I've got a bit of time. Go on, give me an idea. What sort of things do you see? I mean, the cynics would say you're out to make mischief, you're out to make political capital out of a weakened Prime Minister. Tell me that's wrong.
That's not wrong. We want to make sure that we have a strong Queen's speech. This government potentially could be in power going forward, and we want to make sure that the economy in the country doesn't suffer as a result. So we're putting forward a selection of amendments, economic amendments, amendments in relation to industrial strategy, amendments in relation to public safety in the light of the Grenfell horrific incident that we had recently. There'll be a whole range of amendments. Public spending, we want reassurances that our public services will get the money that they need. Social care, again, is another area that we'll concentrate on specifically, because today's speech was very, very vague. It just called for a consultation into social care. So we've no idea what the Prime Minister proposes in terms of social care, but the system is broken and it needs funding urgently.
One rather cruel commentator this morning describing Theresa May as akin to a wounded antelope. Jeremy Corbyn, your team, are you going to go in for the kill?
We're going to go for what's best for the country, and we need a strong and stable government, and we're going to make sure that we put
You've
forward...
just said strong and stable. I never thought I'd hear that from a Labour
Well, I mean, I think it's farcical for the government to call themselves strong and stable, but what the country needs is a stable government that puts forward a vision of the future. We're not seeing that from the Conservative Party. We set out our stall in the general election. Our mission is to serve our constituents and make sure that we deliver the best possible future for them that's possible.
What do you say to voters, and I'm sure you must have come across them on the doorstep, who said, look, let's just get Brexit done. Let's unify, if that's what's required, just for the next couple of years. There is a certain cynicism about politics and politicians at the moment. Let's do what's best for the country. Do you think that's what you're doing?
Well, we do need to do what's best for the country, and we offered our services, shall we say, straight after the referendum result. We said that we would work on a cross-party basis with the government, but they didn't listen. And unfortunately, they are sending us over the edge of a cliff. They're not forming very good relationships with people in Europe. We had Theresa May on the steps of Downing Street in a paranoid state not so long ago, stating that Europe was trying to interfere in our general election. And we know from the discussions so far that they really are not going well at all. So we need to push the government on this, and we'll be giving them guidance and giving them ideas, and we really hope that they listen to us, because this is too important.
No robes, none of the usual ceremony. You were in there. Did it feel a bit flat to you?
Not really. I mean, I think it was the vagueness of the speech was my concern, because we didn't really get any direction or indication about what the government was planning to do over the coming years, and I think that leaves a big question mark over politics, and it leaves a big question mark over the future direction of our economy.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, before this platform disappears from underneath us, they've started work. I don't need to tell you that. Thank you very much. Nice to see you. Let's get a weather update. Chris Fawkes, get me out of here.
Simon, I would have thought it's a little bit hot for drilling weather, really. Temperatures have already reached 30 degrees Celsius, and this is going to be the hottest day of the year so far. Now, I think there's a good chance we'll get to 34 later on today. If we do get 34, that'll be the hottest June day we've seen for over 40 years. You can see the extent of the sunshine, a few thunderstorms across the north, and what will follow is another very warm and humid night. Temperatures 26 in central London at 10 o'clock, perhaps as you're thinking of heading to bed. There are changes afoot, though. We're going to get cooler Atlantic air flowing over the top of the hot air that we've got in place, and this is an explosive recipe. We're going to get some massive thunderstorms breaking out over the next 24 hours. Now, pretty much anywhere is at risk, but especially, I think, across parts of Wales, the Midlands and northern counties of England. We're talking about some of these storms becoming severe, so torrential downpours, maybe some large hail and some gusty winds as well. But eventually, as we get on through Thursday, we'll get that cooler and fresher air moving into much of the UK, although still pretty warm across East Anglia and South East England. That's your latest weather.
The Article 50 process is now underway. The United Kingdom is leaving the European Union.
We want a red, white and blue Brexit. That is the right Brexit for the United Kingdom.
The news is it is a hung parliament. She had a majority of 17. She now doesn't have a majority at all.
We need to make sure that we get a Brexit that delivers for everyone. The approach that the government was taking to a hard Brexit, I think, is dead in the water.
We want a jobs-first Brexit.
As formal talks begin, follow every development and find out what Brexit will mean for you.
all this week on the BBC News Channel.
Alzheimer's has actually helped me to live and enjoy each day as it comes, rather than think, oh, I'll do that in the future, and not do it at all. Just appreciate what you've got that day.
Find out what the UK really thinks and feels. Start your day with BBC Radio 5 Live Breakfast.
Hello, good afternoon. This is BBC Newsroom Live with me, Julian Warwick. More from Simon in a moment at Westminster, but first the latest headlines for you. The government has set out a range of measures it hopes to bring into law over the next 2 years, with Brexit at the top of the agenda. The Queen said her government was committed to building the widest possible consensus on the country's future outside of the EU. New measures on immigration and agriculture were included, but other pledges in the Conservative manifesto were altered after the party failed to get a majority in the snap general election. The Duke of Edinburgh was admitted to hospital last night as a precautionary measure, Buckingham Palace has said. Policing in England and Wales could be at significant risk if resources are diverted to fight terrorism, the UK's top counter-terrorism officer has said. A man suspected of setting off a bomb at Brussels Central Station yesterday has been identified as a 36-year-old Moroccan. Officials say he was carrying a bomb armed with nails and gas canisters. Oscar-winning actor Sir Daniel Day-Lewis, who starred in Gangs of New York and Last of the Mohicans, has retired. A charity single to raise money for those affected by the Grenfell Tower fire has been released. More than 50 stars recorded Bridge Over Troubled Water to support victims' families and survivors.
Well, let's get more now on our coverage from here in Westminster on the Queen's speech. One of the things not in her speech was the expected state visit of one President Donald Trump. He was invited to come to the UK this year by the Prime Minister when she visited the White House in January, and he accepted. But there have been reports that Mr. Trump has changed his mind, doesn't wish to come to the UK, while there's a possibility of protests against him. Well, our diplomatic correspondent James Landale is in our central London studio. James, normally, and in fact the Queen did say she was looking forward to a state visit by the King of Spain, but no mention of Donald Trump. Why?
Well, state visits are state visits. They involve the Queen, naturally, and therefore she always uses this moment to set out her plans, but very specifically said absolutely nothing about the Donald Trump visit. Now, as you said, the Donald Trump visit was something that was formally, the invitation was formally made. It was accepted. The understanding was this year. However, there is no date. Now, Downing Street have been very specific about this. They're saying that the invitation I'll just to read specifically what they say. They say the invitation has been extended and accepted, and the visit wasn't mentioned because no date has yet been set. But there's a very good reason for that date not being set, and that is because there are concerns within the White House that if Donald Trump came here, there would be some substantial protests, and there is also, I think, a concern within the British government that this would not help UK-US relations if the US president came here and was going to be embarrassed. I mean, for example, one of the protests that was planned was for a group of people to pull their trousers down and bare their bottoms at the president under the headline, "Bare your rump to Trump." Now, if that happened on a mass scale, then you can imagine that this is not going to help what some people still call the special relationship.
You've got away with that. In terms of reading between the lines, and no one does that better than you, does that mean it's very unlikely that he's going to be coming here this year?
I think it's very unlikely. It's not definitive. Things can always change. And I think, to be honest, these things, you don't make firm 100% decisions on these things, particularly at a time when the government has got so many other things to think about. I mean, this government has only so much bandwidth. I think trying to work out precisely when they're going to have a visit from the US president, particularly if he is having cold feet, I imagine it's something they'll just say, look, let's put it on the back burner for a bit.
If you remember, when the invitation was first made by Theresa May on behalf of the Queen, there was a lot of concern that she had jumped the gun and that she had gone too fast on this, and that actually to give a new US president the offer of a full state visit was a little premature. Normally that kind of offer doesn't come until well into the presidency. Quite often, if the president has been re-elected, it quite often happens in their second term. And then not all US presidents get full state visits. So I think the fact that it's going to be delayed will not come as a huge disappointment to many people who thought that actually it was a little bit too much too early.
James, thank you very much. James Landale there in our central London studio. Let's talk more about the contents of the Queen's speech. Joining me now, Chuka Umunna, Labour MP for Streatham, chair of the Vote Leave Watch campaign, and Jonathan Isaby, editor of Brexit Central. And Chuka Umunna, if I start with you, Brexit, clearly the major part of the Queen's speech, and isn't that understandable, given, and it's quite clear, there's a huge amount of work to come in the next 2 years?
Absolutely. I mean, I think 8 of the 24 bills that will be presented will touch on Brexit, and it's going to have a fundamental impact on the lives of all your viewers, not just from the point of view of people's jobs and livelihoods, but the extent to which we can continue to advance social justice with our European counterparts, being part of the single market. I am arguing for that. But I don't think it was just a kind of Brexit Queen's speech, because there's a huge domestic policy agenda beyond Brexit. Look, we have one of the biggest gaps between the rich and the poor in the advanced world. We've got millions of people in work living in poverty. We've got people can't access the basics, affordable housing to rent and to buy. So that is also going to be a focus of Parliament going forward. But one of the exciting things, I think, is that this could be a golden age for Parliament because of the parliamentary arithmetic in that place. We've got a minority government for the first time in years. Every single vote in the House of Commons is going to count, and the vote of every single MP is going to count in a way that it didn't in the last Parliament. So we as individual members of Parliament have an influence that we didn't have in previous Parliaments, and that is a good thing. We can't just have the executive and Theresa May a kind of really diminished Prime Minister determining everything from number 10. The legislature now will get a role that maybe it didn't have before.
Jonathan, is that a good thing? Because obviously Theresa May went to the polls on the basis that she would then have a mandate for Brexit. She needed the strength for these negotiations. She hasn't got it.
There is a mandate for Brexit if you look at both the Conservative and Labour Party manifestos and indeed the UKIP manifesto, which 85% of people voted for at the election just the other week. There was a mandate for coming out of the single market, coming out of the customs union and taking back control over all those areas. Chuka talks about a golden age of Parliament. There will be a golden age of Parliament when once again the people in the building behind us are voting on British laws. For far too long there have been people sitting in Brussels who've been deciding our destiny in this country, and this Queen's speech has got a whole range of measures which bring back control over immigration, over agriculture, over fisheries and a whole lot more besides back to this building.
Look, this idea that there was this grand mandate to leave in a way that destroys people's jobs, that reduces social justice.
Well, that's your take on it. There was a vote, there was a vote to leave.
There was a vote to leave the European Union, but how you do that is up for debate and should be tested. This idea that somehow people voted to just jump off a cliff and not do a deal with the European Union, well, that has completely been run roughshod through by the general election result, because clearly people, I don't think, wanted that. And the idea that people wanted to leave in a way that cuts all the economic ties, all the benefits that we have in the European Union away, when actually there are other countries who are not in the European Union, like Norway, that's a member of the single market, or Turkey, that's a member of the customs union.
What's your evidence for saying that when all your colleagues are saying that all that they heard on the doorsteps during the election campaign was domestic matters? It was housing, it was austerity, it was the NHS.
But they're all connected, though, in my view, because if you look at all of what we know leaving, say, the single market involves, that will have an immediate hit on the revenues to the Exchequer, the tax take, which will massively compromise a future Labour government that I want to see its ability to end years of Tory austerity. But also, there's another dimension to this, is the domestic policy agenda touches on things like employment law, like environmental protections, consumer protections. That is at the heart of what the single market has been all about. And one of the things, if you just let me finish the point, by all means, But one of the challenges we have is you've got big multinational companies that operate across borders, challenging those things, trying to resist the protections that people have. So it makes sense for us in this UK Parliament and the government to work with other countries to ensure that we get the best protections and best things for our peoples.
All those protections that Chuka talks about, workers' rights, environment protections and so on, are things which are going to be put into British law on the day that Brexit happens through the repeal bill, which was announced in the Queen's speech just this morning. And then you, as British politicians, can decide whether to keep them or not. And clearly there seems to be a consensus of keeping them because the government has said they want to and you said you want to. It's about taking back control, though. Chuka says he wants us to stay in the single market. If we stay in the single market, we are bound by rules of freedom of movement, something which the EU has made clear is absolutely sacrosanct. We would not be able to have control of our borders if we stay in the single market.
A clean break is
Let me say a couple of things about that. On freedom of movement, there's a huge myth that is built that somehow freedom of movement is unconditional. It isn't, it's conditional. So at the moment, as full members of the European Union, if we want to require people to leave this country after they've been here for 3 months and haven't got work and don't have the prospect of work, we can do that, but we choose not to. So we can actually gain more control over our immigration policy now as full members of the European Union. And the second thing is, look, the idea that all the laws here determine everything that impacts on people is ridiculous. We operate in a global economy. Globalisation is a phenomenon that's knocking people around. And the best way we can marshal those forces and try and get them to go in a more socially just direction is working by others around the globe. And the best motor for us to do that has been the European Union. So, look, I accept we're leaving.
Aren't you?
I voted for Article 50,
Will you
and I
vote
voted
for the
to
repeal
agree.
bill which revokes the European Communities Act 1972?
Well, look, it depends.
Because if you don't, people will say, how can you say you're accepting the result?
It depends what's in it. I'm not going to give a blank cheque to Theresa May and Tory ministers like Priti Patel and others who've talked about doing away with people's rights at work, doing away with different protections.
The government haven't said
yes,
that.
they have. They have said that. Cabinet ministers have said that. They're on the record saying that. So am I going to give those people a blank cheque to run roughshod over the rights of my constituents?
It's a matter for Parliament to make those
Absolutely not.
The question was, will you fight
I agree that Parliament should, of course, be the
Will you
primary
fight
motor
the
on
Great
this.
Repeal Bill? Will you say we're against?
Well, I don't actually know what's going to be in it. So you're asking me, will I fight something? I don't know what the contents are going to be.
If it's about just transferring powers from the European Union into British law.
If that is all it is, but we don't know. And in the end, the rubber will hit the road when all these different bills, which make up the Queen's speech, are debated on the floor of the House of Commons. And then I'm happy to, I can answer something. I can answer a question then, because I know what I'm talking about. At the moment, I don't know what's going to be in that Great Repeal Bill.
Simon, this time last year, 17.4 million people voted for us to leave the European Union. More people who voted Tory, more people than voted Labour last week. And if politicians in the building behind us don't vote for the repeal bill, they will say, how can you claim you are accepting the result, which was delivered so clearly just a year ago?
And what is the Labour approach going to be in the coming week in terms of the debate on? Are you sensing blood, and therefore you're going to be bloody? You're going to make life as difficult as possible for this government?
Look, we will act by reference to our values and what we believe as a party, and we want to create a fairer, more equal society. We're too unequal. If you are of a particular background, you certainly don't have the opportunities of others of a more wealthy background. And so we will be guided by our principles and what we believe in terms of how we decide to vote on the different laws that come before us. So this isn't a game-playing thing. This is about people's lives, and that's what we'll be guided by.
Last word from Jonathan. In terms of Brexit, here we are. This is the moment things start to actually move, is it?
Yeah, this is an incredibly important moment. The referendum was a year ago. Obviously, the government has spent the last year preparing for the negotiations which started just this week, and now this all-important legislation is on the table to be debated by parliamentarians over the coming 2 years in order to ensure that there is a clean and orderly withdrawal in 2 years' time, which is why that repeal bill is so important.
Gentlemen, we could go on for a lot more. I suspect you two might. But anyway, Chuka, Jonathan, thank you both very much for coming. Thank you. So it was a rather toned-down event here at the Palace of Westminster today. No robes, no horses, no particular ceremony. And of course, the news that the Duke of Edinburgh had been taken into hospital last night, that emerged half an hour before the Queen appeared here with Prince Charles beside her. But in terms of the politics, of course, Theresa May, that analogy of a wounded antelope, one of the commentators describing her this morning, and still no deal with the DUP. So let's talk about that. With me now is our Northern Ireland political editor, Mark Devonport. And Mark, it Is this just how the DUP operates? They're just playing for what they can get out of this?
Well, there might be something to that. They've always been hard negotiators. They've been through many talks processes before, and they will play things down to the wire. And the wire was not necessarily today. The wire could be next week when we actually get a vote on the Queen's
Well, we've got the impression Theresa May that today was the wire, so something's shifted.
Well, certainly we've been at this now, I think, something like 11 days, and Downing Street announced that they had a deal on day one, and they suddenly found out that it wasn't quite as simple as that. The simple bits of the deal, if you like, is that the DUP, they do tend to vote with the Conservatives anyway. They obviously agree with the Conservatives on Brexit, but the harder bits is what the DUP is asking for potentially in terms of extra funding for Northern Ireland. Reports today of as much as £1 billion of extra health funding, £1 billion of extra infrastructure funding. That's the kind of thing which the Treasury may well choke on if it worries about what could be the knock-on effect for other regions, saying what happens with us.
Well, of course, that's and the DUP are acutely aware of that, aren't they?
Yes, so I mean, I think some elements will no doubt be dressed up in any package as specific to Northern Ireland and the challenges that it faces. We've had specific, for instance, funds offered before in terms of loans for shared education, all sorts of things that are specific to Northern Ireland. So they'll maybe be able to work to some extent on that in order to not replicate this along the way. But if there are other big ticket items that have a potential effect across the UK, that's a problem. For instance, air passenger duty, we know that that's one of the DUP's asks. It fits both their economic concerns and their political concerns. People from Northern Ireland often have to get on an aeroplane to come across here. They want to increase connections east and west throughout the UK, so they want that. But we've already seen, because Labour put out a statement on this late last week, Labour honing in saying, well, if you forego air passenger duty from Northern Ireland, that's £90 million of lost revenue. That could pay for thousands of firefighters. So this is the kind of argument that we'll get if the Treasury is too generous.
And what about Arlene Foster? Are you getting a sense that maybe she's getting a bit fed up with this?
Well, obviously they're pushing to get as good a deal as they can get, and certainly last night they were beginning to brief, and some of it I think is straight up that they felt that they were getting a chaotic approach from Downing Street, a lack of focus. Some of that is maybe just their straight assessment of what's going on. Some of it is tactics, because when the DUP talk about the Treasury nitpicking, the Treasury would no doubt say, look, we're trying to save vital taxpayers' money here. So all of these things are still in play, might go to next week, might come more imminently than that. There was some talk about a deal even tomorrow. At the moment, the lesson of Northern Ireland talks tends to be that if we've got a deadline, we'll go right up to it and maybe beyond it.
Mark, thank you very much. Mark Devonport. Plenty more to come from Westminster. We're hoping to hear from Ian Duncan-Smith in the next few minutes, so come back to us for that. But now, back to you, Julian.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Now, the Duke of Edinburgh has been admitted to hospital because of an infection. Buckingham Palace says it's a precautionary measure for treatment arising from a pre-existing condition. The Duke, who is 96, is due to retire from public duties in August. A spokesman said he was disappointed to miss the state opening of Parliament and Royal Ascot. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, has confirmed that resources are being shifted to counter-terrorism work because of the workload created by the terror attacks in London and Manchester. Ms Dick said the terror attacks had taken place against a background of increasing demand on policing in London, and this had an impact on other investigations.
We have supplemented the National Counter-Terrorism Network from some of our crime resources, nationally and in London. And we need to do that. And we are shifting resources across our different resources and people across the Met. This does have an impact on other, for example, investigations. We've had to pause some, we've had to slow down on some, and that's just a necessity.
Cressida Dick. Soldiers have shot dead a suspected suicide bomber in Brussels as he triggered a small explosion at one of its busiest railway stations. Prosecutors said the bomb consisted of nails and gas bottles placed inside a bag, and they were treating it as a terrorist incident. No one else is believed to have been injured. King Salman of Saudi Arabia has changed the line of succession to make his son Mohammed bin Salman the crown prince and first in line to the throne. Prince Salman replaces the previous crown prince, Mohammed bin Nayef, who's been stripped of his title. Aged just 31, Mohammed bin Salman was already the Minister of Defence and has been leading efforts to reform the Saudi economy. As Crown Prince, he now stands to inherit the kingdom. The announcement was made on Saudi television.
The custodian of the two holy mosques, King Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, has issued royal decrees relieving His Royal Highness Prince Mohammed bin Nayef bin Abdulaziz from his position as Crown Prince and from the position as Deputy Prime Minister, and appointing His Royal Highness Prince Mohammed bin Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud as Crown Prince and Deputy Prime Minister, while continuing his role as Defence Minister.
Failures in care are one of the main causes of stillbirths and brain injuries in newborn babies in the UK. That's according to a report out today. The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists found the most common mistakes related to the monitoring of fetal heart rates during labour. It wants to cut the number of neonatal errors by half by the year 2020. Our social affairs correspondent Michael Buchanan has more.
This is Barnaby, a 4-month-old, happy, bouncing baby. He should have an older brother, who'd now be 18 months. But medical mistakes made at birth meant that Alfie died within hours of being born. Despite concerns about his health, staff failed to perform a caesarean section, leaving the newborn with fatal brain injuries.
It's a life that didn't need to be taken that's been taken. It was a whole future for everybody, for our family, for Alfie, just taken in an instant because medics who were paid to do a job didn't do it correctly that day.
Too many other families have suffered similar heartache. Today's report says that in 2015, 3/4 of babies who either died at birth or suffered severe brain injury could have had a different outcome with better care. A failure to properly monitor the fetus and poor team working in labour wards were common problems.
No death of a baby is acceptable, but we must be able to take the lessons we've learnt from this very robust and detailed analysis and turn the situation round.
Experts think that many more healthy babies can be born in the UK if NHS maternity units improve. The Field family hope they're right, and that other families don't suffer as they have. Michael Buchanan, BBC News.
Head teachers from 17 council areas in England are writing to parents, urging them to put pressure on their MPs to address what they call the growing funding crisis in schools. The joint letter to almost 2 million families warns that there could be job losses and cuts in subject choices. The government says it will continue to invest record levels in education. The founder of the taxi-hailing app Uber, Travis Kalanick, has resigned as chief executive officer following demands from 5 major investors. He'd already stepped aside temporarily. Uber has been battling allegations of harassment, discrimination and corporate misconduct. The 3-time Oscar-winning actor Sir Daniel Day-Lewis has announced his retirement. The 60-year-old says it's a private decision and he's immensely grateful to everyone he's worked with and to his audiences. His career has seen him tackle a huge variety of roles and has won him international acclaim, as Simon Clemerson reports.
Daniel Day-Lewis as Christy Brown, who with cerebral palsy learnt to paint with his left foot.
I know who it is.
And this is the same actor.
What the others promised to do.
And again...
Slavery, sir. It's done.
Still, Day-Lewis.
I am the President of the United States, clothed in immense power.
Daniel, you're right!
Now 60, Daniel Day-Lewis is famous for putting huge amounts of effort into perfecting the parts he's played, creating a cast of very different characters. The portrayal of the former US president won him his 3rd Oscar for Best Actor, something still no other leading man has achieved. He's chosen his roles extremely carefully before immersing himself in them.
I think I'm definitely out of character at this moment. But if I slip back into it by mistake, you can do an intervention of some kind, the Heimlich maneuver or whatever you do with actors that get stuck in character. I don't know, but no, I'm definitely out of character now.
There is one more movie in the pipeline, so Daniel Day-Lewis won't quite disappear from the screen yet, but he is retiring. He's given no reason why. A statement simply said it was a private decision. Simon Clemerson, BBC News.
Now, today is the summer solstice in the Northern Hemisphere, the longest day of the year. Large crowds gathered at the ancient site of Stonehenge in Wiltshire to see the sunrise. The sun only reaches the middle of the stones on this day each year when it shines on the central altar. Clouds often obscure the scene, but not this year. And with that in mind, the UK is set to experience its hottest June day for more than 40 years, with temperatures in some parts forecast to soar to 34 degrees later on. It means it could be hotter than it is in the Maldives, Dubai or Los Angeles. But while most people have been enjoying the sunshine, it's been causing problems for others, as Holly Hamilton now reports.
75, 80, 86 and the temperature still rising. The heatwave hits Britain.
It's a time-honoured tradition. As the temperature rises, Britain embraces the heat. Well, for a few days anyway.
And the fashion of the day is the briefest of brief swimsuits.
I embrace it. So obviously not today because I'm wearing black jeans, but yeah, I think it makes everybody happy.
Quite beautiful actually.
It is, yeah. It makes a change from the rain. I love it. Hotter the better.
So we're now entering the 5th consecutive day of 30-plus temperatures here in Britain, and while most of us have been enjoying the good weather, some just find it too hot to handle.
Just can't cope when the heat is kind of really humid, and especially this time of year as well, when it's kind of the pollen count is high as well.
Sometimes it can get too much, it can get too hot and sticky, so it's like I'd rather be at home than go outside.
It's been more than 20 years since Britain has enjoyed these temperatures for this long, but how did we cope in 1995 without Twitter to share our struggle to sleep in the heat? Hospitals and emergency services have been put on high alert, while the TUC has even issued guidelines urging employers to let staff ditch the shirt and ties in these sweltering conditions. Don't expect to see as many top and tails at Royal Ascot this weekend. For the first time, organisers have even relaxed their strict dress code. And while we may be familiar with the advice around pets and hot cars, scorching pavements have also become an issue for our four-legged friends.
They can result in sort of burns and blisters on the feet. Just take your dogs for a walk very early morning or very late in the evening so it's cooled down, the temperatures have dropped. So your pet then, it reduces the risk of being overheated and also any problems with the pavements being too hot.
Love it or hate it, like every British summer, it's not set to last. Parts of the country can expect heavy downpours this afternoon and temperatures are expected to fall. So business as usual, and we'll still be complaining about the weather. Holly Hamilton, BBC News.
In a moment, it'll be the news at 1 with Sophie Raworth at Westminster first, though the weather forecast from Chris Fawkes.
Hi there. Today is going to be the hottest day of the year so far. Now, if temperatures do hit 34 degrees, and I think there's a pretty good chance of that, well, it would be the hottest June day that we've seen for over 40 years. It's hot across a good part of England and Wales, but across the Midlands and North East England, it's going to be a much hotter day compared with yesterday, for some temperatures around 7 or 8 degrees higher. Now, look at this Weather Watch picture. It shows a type of cloud called Altocumulus castellanis. It's a type of cloud we often see ahead of thunderstorms. So we've already seen that Altocumulus castellanis is a sign that the atmosphere is ready to go bang. Now, through this afternoon, across much of England and Wales, well, we've got lots of sunshine, clear blue skies in many cases, maybe with a little bit of that Altocumulus castellanis cloud developing, more especially across Wales and northern England, where we could see a few storms breaking out during this afternoon. We've also got a risk of some storms across Northern Ireland, southern parts of Scotland as well. To the north, probably some thicker cloud just bringing some wet weather at times. Now, it's going to be another hot night tonight after such a hot day. Temperatures, perhaps as you're going to bed at 10 o'clock, still up at 26 degrees Celsius, so another steamy one, but that's just half the picture. The heat wave you see is coming to an end. The hot air with us at the moment is going to be overrun by cooler air in higher parts of the atmosphere. It's an explosive mix. And as we go through this afternoon, this evening and overnight, we're going to see some big thunderstorms breaking out, with some of these storms becoming severe. Now, we're talking about the risk of some torrential downpours, some gusty winds, and maybe for some large hail. But the detail about where those storms will hit is still a bit uncertain. But I would suggest anywhere across Wales, the Midlands and northern counties of England in the firing line from this afternoon to tomorrow afternoon as well. Temperatures through tomorrow will be cooler and fresher for many areas, but still pretty warm across parts of southeast England. Temperatures up to 26 degrees here, but will continue to drop a little bit as we get on closer towards the weekend. Friday will be quite a breezy day, fresher air with us for most of us. For most of us, temperatures back close to normal. Sunny spells and a few showers moving in across western areas. And the weekend, a lot of bright weather, quite a bit of cloud, some sunny spells and temperatures back to normal, which means more comfortable night's sleep ahead.
The Queen's speech in Westminster, it is dominated by Brexit as the government sets out its agenda for the next 2 years.